Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending which time zone you're in. We're expecting to be joined by quite a large number of participants today. We've had a very significant number of registrations, but people will presumably join us while we're doing the introductions. Well, my name is John Bachler. I'm a co-director of the European Policies Research Centre at the University of Strathclyde and the Delft University of Technology, and we're delighted to welcome so many participants to this webinar today. Today we are welcoming Josip Mihalic, who'll be presenting a comparison between the implementation of cohesion policy and the recovery and resilience mechanism. We expect the presentation to last about 30 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. And as usual, if you'd like to make an intervention, please feel free to use the Zoom hand function, or feel free to use the chat function as well. Before introducing the speaker, I'd just like to inform you that the meeting is being recorded, which means that you and your colleagues will have the opportunity to follow the meeting at a later stage. The recording will be made available on the EPRC YouTube channel and shared with you by email. And we very much encourage you to use Twitter to share your thoughts on the webinar. So let me present our speaker today. As I said, we're delighted to welcome Josip Mihalic, who's the director of the Office for Recovery and Resilience in Slovenia. He has long experience of working in the public sector for over 2 decades, with experience in implementing EU Cohesion Policy in Slovenia, as well as work in the field of development planning overall before coming to his current position. Josip has also worked as a consultant for international organizations such as the World Bank, and has a Master of Science in the field of EU policy analysis. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Josip Mihalic to compare the implementation of EU cohesion policy and the RRF.
Thanks a lot, John. So first, thank you for the invitation to be part of today's event. It is a pleasure for me to join this event. It is not first time to be part of, let's say, different events which are organized by the EPRC or IQNet. Before that, I was, as you already presented, part of implementation of cohesion policy in Slovenia for many years, more or less on a level of managing authority. And since May of 2022, I'm part of implementation of RRF in Slovenia as a director of coordinating body, which is responsible for the overall coordination of implementation of RRF in Slovenia. And also we are responsible for the, let's say, coordination with the Commission services also when talking about the implementation. I will try to present briefly the main differences or similarities between cohesion policy and RRF implementation. But just to begin with one thought, which was part of, let's say, broader discussion, or is still a broader discussion within the implementation of cohesion policy. We usually try to highlight the issue of importance of simplifying the implementation of a cohesion policy on one side, and also we usually try to highlight the issue of let's say smooth transition from the let's say, concentration to the eligibility of expenditure, to the result-based management of cohesion policy. It was hard. It was always hard discussion with the Commission and other stakeholders within this, but we never succeed in this regard so far. But on the other side, we have implementation of RRF, which was, let's say, quick response to COVID-19 pandemic, with a very innovative approach, with an approach which was, let's say, part of all of a discussion within the cohesion policy. So how to try, let's say, to simplify the implementation and how to introduce the result-based management. So RRF is a mechanism where we can see the real implementation of ideas which was presented within the cohesion policy and never part of, let's say, concrete implementation. I will just make a very broad distinction between cohesion policy and RRF as I see it. So the key aspect or key objective of a cohesion policy is concentrated to the so-called regional development across the EU. On the other side, when talking about the RRF, we are talking about the, let's say, national policies which are we implemented across EU. When talking about the management aspect, it's very important to highlight that the cohesion policy is within the shared management, where the member state and European Commission is, let's say, they are sharing responsibilities for the proper implementation of cohesion policy. On the other side, when talking about the RRF mechanism, we are talking about the centralized coordinated mechanism. So this is the, let's say, very important differences where within the RRF implementation, the key role of Commission services is very important. Then what is also significant difference between two mechanisms. On one side, as I already said, when talking about the cohesion policy implementation, we are talking about the concrete investments, concrete projects, and eligible expenditure at the end. And we are talking about the co-financing of eligible expenditure. When talking about the RRF implementation, it's something completely different. We are talking about the reforms. We are talking about the investments. We are talking about the milestones and targets. We are not talking about the, let's say, eligible expenditure or non-eligible expenditures. So this is also one of very important difference between those two mechanisms. And when talking about, let's say, on one side, eligible expenditure and on the other side, reforms and investments, it's also important to highlight that, let's say, income from the cohesion policy is based on eligible expenditure. But income for the member state or EU funds for the member states in the RRF mechanism, we are not talking about just about the implementation of investments which are generating the, let's say, income from the EU budget to the national budget. No, we are talking about the implementation of reforms and investments. Reforms on one side, they usually don't have any financial breakdown. So let's say reform is for free within the RRF mechanism. But at the end, the implementation of reforms generate the income from the EU budget for the national budget. So just implementation of investment part of RRF mechanism doesn't mean that member state will receive all the potential resources from the RRF mechanism. So at the end, we will have to present also the part of reforms, which has to be, let's say, successfully implemented on the national level. So in Slovenia, but not only in Slovenia, we are facing the period where we are implementing, or we are in the phase of closure of previous programming period of cohesion policy. We are now in the beginning of, let's say, implementation of a next financial perspective, cohesion policy then, and we are in the middle of implementation of RRF in Slovenia. So we are talking about the three main components or main development components on the EU level, which are implemented on the national level. What is the main challenge in this regard for a small country as a Slovenia is so that our resources, human resources on the administration level is limited. So how to cover, let's say, three pillars of EU implementation or EU policies implementation on a national level with, let's say, competent staff. It was not easy, or it is still not easy, because let's say that we are competing between two different mechanisms. So we are competing for the same people to implement quick and in a proper manner, or cohesion policy on one side, or RRF on other side. So this is not an easy task. We are limited with the experienced people or staff at the national level, and just when talking about, let's say, our organization as a coordinating body within the RRF mechanism, it is still not easy to get, let's say, proper number of qualified staff for in the implementation of RRF in Slovenia. Few words about the cohesion policy of previous programming period. So we are at the end, almost at the end. As you see from the information which is on the slides, on the slide, we are talking about the overcommitments when addressing the previous programming period. So more than 110% of available funds are, let's say, on the ground with the, let's say, with the implementation of calls, projects, programs, public tenders, and so on. So on the other side, when talking about the approved operations, we are still on the safe side. Let's say that we are facing the number of, or share of 107% of available funds on a level of approved operations. But when talking about the, let's say, payments from our national budget, we still have a gap to fill till the end of the year. The main challenge in this regard is the implementation of Recover EU. I think, yeah, Recover EU. So it was a very short period for the implementation of this additional part, which was, let's say, added to the cohesion policy at the latest moment within the Next Generation EU facility. So in this regard, we still have some real challenges how to properly spend the available resources. We had some difficulties, especially regarding the implementation investments in the health sector, where let's say, the preparation of concrete large investments was not so easy as was planned ideally at the beginning. When talking about the RRF implementation in Slovenia, the resources which are available for Slovenia, we are talking about the 2.5 billion euros right now. This is according to the existing RRP. So RRP is a national recovery and resilience plan, which is based for the implementation of RRF in Slovenia and all other member states. What is interesting in this regard, that we are using not only grants, but we are also using the loan component in this regard. So grants in existing RRP, there is 1.8 billion euros allocation, but we have to say that according to the last let's say, decision of the Commission, according to the approved legislation on the EU level, and according to the, let's say, GDP comparison between year 2020 and 2021, we are facing the decrease of grant component for the 286 million euros. That means that we are in a process of, let's say, adjustment of RRP to address this decrease of a grant component. At the same time, when talking about the RRP adjustment, we have to say that according to the new initiative within the RRF, that means that I'm talking about the Repower EU, the mechanism or specific part of the RRF, which will address the, let's say, the energy part of investments or reforms within the RRF according to the developments because of crisis in Ukraine. So we will address the issues of, let's say, energy efficiency and so on. And in this regard, Slovenia will receive 117 million euros of grant additionally. And also we will in this regard use 5 million euros which are available for Slovenia within the Brexit adjustment reserve. We didn't manage to spend this allocation so far, so there is a possibility to transfer this allocation to the RRF, and we will do so. Our RRP is divided in 4 main components: green, digital, smart, healthcare, and social security. You can also see the financial breakdown within the 4 main categories, and within the main categories you can also see the, let's say, sub-priorities which are addressed within the existing RRP. The Repower EU will be a new chapter, the 5th one within the RRP, and this is also part of a modification or adjustment of RRP in Slovenia. So because of decrease of grant component, because of Repower EU, we will adjust the RRP in Slovenia, but not only for those 2 reasons. There is additional one, and we will address this issue also. We will address the objective circumstances, which are part of, let's say, broader socioeconomic environment. Because of inflation and other, let's say, objective circumstances, we will address also this part of implementation. What is very important within the RRF, at the end, we are talking about the milestones and targets. Milestones and targets, as you probably know, we are talking about the milestones and targets which are timely defined and also defined as, let's say, as indicators relating to the reforms and relating to the concrete investments. And according to the defined milestones and targets, let's say the member states will receive the EU funds in this regard, but only if all the milestones and targets which are part of the installment for the payment will be implemented in full. And this is also our main objective. On a national level to, let's say, fulfill all the milestones and targets which are in the RRP so far. What was very important in this regard was that, let's say, in total value of resources which are available for Slovenia within the RRF, more than 40%, let's say, of total allocation is going to the green transition goals, and more than 20% are dedicated to the digital transition within the total allocation of RRF for Slovenia. What is very important in the implementation of RRF, I already mentioned the installment. So in green columns, you have information of planned and timeline for the payment requests, which are 10 in the grant component and 6 for the loan component. That means that according to the timeline, we have to fulfill all the milestones which are and targets which are part of installment to receive the resources which are planned for each installment. In so far implementation, I have to say that Slovenia sent to the Commission services in October of last year first payment request for the first installment, and just these days there will be a conclusion on the Council EU level that we are successfully past all the, let's say, checks at the Commission level, especially. That means that that 57 million euros will be transferred to the national budget in the mid-April. What is interesting in this regard also that when talking about the 57 million euros and all others, and in all other cases, we are talking about the brutto, not the net value. So that means that we will receive 50 million euros in real costs. We as a member state receive 231 million euros of prepayment in the implementation of RRF. When talking about the cohesion policy on the other side for the new programming period, what is important, that partnership agreement was signed in September last year. The cohesion policy program was adopted by the Commission or approved by the Commission in the late December of last year. That's why we didn't let's say, lose the commitments for the first years, because we were, our program was approved in the last moment, not to have any difficulties with the, let's say, with the already planned commitments of financial allocation. The allocation is very similar than the previous one. We are talking about the 3.2 billion euros, which is very similar to the previous programming period. And let's say, when talking about the end of implementation of cohesion policy, okay, we know that we are talking about the end of 2029, and when talking about the RRF component or mechanism, the end of programming period will come with the end of 2026. So the timeline of implementation of RRF is shorter in comparison with the cohesion policy of a next generation. When talking about the split of available resources, there is a figure on the slide, and what is, let's say, important in this regard, that Slovenia also used opportunity to transfer the planned allocation for ESF Plus to the ERDF. That was, let's say, part of a very tough discussion with the Commission services. In this regard, our first proposal was much higher, but at the end, this was the final figure, 61 million euros. And at the beginning, I think that our proposal was more than 100 million euros in this regard. What is interesting in this programming period, that part of cohesion policy is also implementation of JTF mechanism. So we will cover 2 regions in Slovenia with a JTF as part of implementation of cohesion policy. Here we have, let's say, more specific breakdown of resources which are available for the Slovenia in the next programming period and are part of, let's say, partnership agreement. What is also specific in Slovenia, because as a small country, we have just one operational program on the national level. So our OP is multi-fund OP, and also it is multi-regional OP, because we are facing the reality in Slovenia that we have 2 cohesion regions, so western and the eastern part of Slovenia, and the eastern part is less developed and the western part is the more developed region. That means that we have to follow all the necessary conditions when addressing the financial allocation for each region. That was a very, let's say, difficult question on a national level, especially when talking about the implementation of so-called regional investments, where the, let's say, local communities are the main beneficiaries. It was challenged how to address those local communities in the western part of Slovenia, which are at the same level of development as, let's say, few local communities on the eastern part of Slovenia. So the co-financing rate in the eastern part is much better, let's say, than on the western part. And we, as Slovenia, address this issue in a manner that for specific area of, let's say, regional development, which is part of implementation of our OP, we plan additional national co-financing of investments to be, let's say, to have equal opportunities for local communities which are at the same level of development in Slovenia. Because we have, this is probably not only the case in Slovenia, but elsewhere also. When talking about the development of western part of Slovenia, part of western Slovenia is also Ljubljana, the capital one. So because of, let's say, because of Ljubljana, there is a very high, let's say, level of development in the West, but in comparison with some other local communities which are not as a capital in Slovenia, the situation is, let's say, not very brilliant. So we address this issue also. So what are the key differences and similarities? As I already said, in the context of the cohesion policy, there is still a lot of talk about the simplifying the system and focusing on the results. But it will be interesting to see if the, let's say, the knowledge from the RRF implementation will be transferred to the cohesion policy of the next generation. So after the 2027, because as we already see, some, let's say, some governance and or the RRF specifics are already integrated in some other EU policies, as we are discussing the, let's say, the implementation of social climate fund, which will be also established. The implementation will be in a manner of our RRF. So it is just a question, or is there will be also a possibility to transfer this knowledge from RRF mechanism to the cohesion policy for the next generation. When talking the governance and management, as I already said, we had difficulties within the cohesion policy and within the RRF to receive sufficient number of qualified personnel to work with the issue. So let's say in managing authority within the cohesion policy, which is only one in Slovenia, I think that they are dealing with the number more than 100, let's say, qualified personnel dealing with the implementation. When talking about the coordinating body for the implementation of RRF, where we are implementing 2.5 billion euros, which is, let's say, not significantly less than in cohesion policy, we are just 23 right now dealing with the implementation. At the same time, when talking about the level of IBs or intermediate bodies, in more or less all cases, we have the situation that one ministry is responsible for the implementation of, let's say, investments within the cohesion policy, and the same ministry is involved in the implementation of RRF. But in RRF, not only within the investment part, but also within the reform part. So at the same time, probably more or less the same personnel is dealing with two different components. And within the cohesion policy, also with two different components. So with the previously programming period and the new one. So this is, let's say, one specific in Slovenia. When talking about the number of line ministries which are involved in implementation, what is very specific in Slovenia that in RRF, the number of line ministries and all other, let's say, governmental bodies is 19. So it's very hard to coordinate 19 different, let's say, content, and also different organizations. So this was, let's say, in the planning of implementation of RRF, one of, let's say, key mistake, maybe, which was integrated in the implementation. So too many different components or contents, and too many different line ministries and other governmental bodies which are involved in the implementations. Because let's say we are facing the situation that on one side we have a line ministry with the allocation of resources within the RRF, let's say approximately 400 million euros, and on other side we have also the case where we have a line ministry with the allocation of 200,000 euros. But at the same time, you have to establish the equal or the same management system for both, and that is one specific on the Slovenian side. When talking about the programming, it is interesting that let's say the programming in a cohesion policy, it seems to be very slow. At the end of the process, we can face the speed up the process, but at the beginning, it is very slow, gradual process with a lot of analysis involved in the preparation and so on. So the public debate is very broad in the field of programming when talking about the cohesion policy. When talking about the programming of RRF in Slovenia, what was the case? First, the RRF was something new for us, completely new. And not only for us, but also for the Commission services. And that's why we as a national authorities and also Commission services at the beginning start to programming the RRF within the knowledge of programming of cohesion policy programs. And that was let's say, one of the major mistakes. So in the middle of the process of programming, there was assessment of a commission that we went in the wrong direction, and we have to start from the scratch. And also it was a message for the Commission services also. They didn't prepare themselves to program the RRPs especially in Slovenia, but probably also in other member states, in a manner that we have to concentrate ourselves on the milestones, on the targets, on the reforms and the investments. That was something completely new. So how to put this puzzle together to have an RRP at the end. The time frame for the programming was very short within the RRF. So everything was prepared very quickly. The discussion with all possible stakeholders, there was discussion, but it was very quick. And at the same time, it was also opened a discussion of a broader discussion about the cohesion policy program. So that was also some, let's say, trigger that makes some confusions in the preparation of RRP in Slovenia, because our time frame was much shorter than cohesion time frame. And at the end, let's say, also stakeholders didn't understand the differences between one and other mechanism. So when they addressed the issue, they didn't know which part of or which mechanism they addressed. RRF, cohesion policy. It was something pretty confusing for them also. When talking about the conditions for making payments, as I already said, in a cohesion policy, the experience is well known. We have eligible expenditure. When we have a, let's say, amount of eligible expenditure, we submit a payment request to the EU and we receive the EU resources. But when talking about and Yeah, and when talking about the milestones and targets within the RRF implementation, I already said that we have installments, we have timeline for installments, and according to the installment, 209 milestones and targets are put in different installments. So we have to, let's say, manage the implementation completely differently than in the cohesion policy to receive the, let's say, funds from the EU budget. And in this regard, we are facing some challenges. So if I said that the programming process was very fast and we didn't have experience, any experience in the, let's say, programming the result-based program, we saw that some projections in the RRP are very optimistic, or was planned very optimistically. And now, when we are implementing those investments and reforms, we are facing that the timelines, which are real now, are, let's say, they are with the delay. And we are facing not only Slovenia, but all other member states, not all, but let's say majority of them, we are facing the delays in implementation. Why also? Because when talking about eligible expenditure, it's on the member state mainly to, let's say, to make all the controls of eligibility. When talking about the achievement of milestones and targets, as I said, the Commission is the major player in the implementation of RRF because it's a centralized managed program. So per each milestone and each target which is achieved or not, the assessment have to come from the Commission services. It's the assessment is not based on the national level, but on the EU level. So you can imagine that in our case, for each of 209 milestones and targets, there has to be a positive assessment of a Commission at the end to fulfill all the criteria. I said that we submit first payment claim in October, and we will receive first payment from the EU budget in April. So you can imagine the time frame of assessment of a Commission services of our first payment claim. We had to say that Commission services at the beginning also assess a few systemic issues. That's why the process was so long. But at the end, our first payment claim was made just with 12 milestones. And for 12 milestones, we need, let's say, this kind of time to have a positive assessment of a Commission. We have to say that when Commission assessing the achievement of milestones and targets, they are very strict. So at the end, we have RRP and implementing decision of a council. The implementing decision of a council, where we have a definition of all milestones and targets with the time frame. Time frames is like a contract between member state and the EU. So all the lawyers on the Commission side, they are reading the document very strictly so far with no flexibility. And suddenly the pressure was so hard from all member states that Commission has to present some flexibilities in this regard when talking about the assessment of achievement of milestones and targets. And a month ago, or a few weeks earlier also, there was a Commission communication, special one, which addressed also possible simplifications or flexibilities on the level of a commission when assessing the achievement of milestones and targets. And then also we understand that this will somehow influence the speedier implementation of RRF in all member states. Then, when talking about the monitoring and control and audit, just to highlight that
Sorry, Josip, could you finish in the next few minutes so we can allow some time to questions?
Okay.
Thanks, that'd be great.
When talking about the monitoring, it was interesting at the beginning, not only regarding monitoring, but overall, the EU regulation said that in implementation of RRF, we can rely on our national system of implementation. But at the end, it was that we planned to rely on our national system of monitoring, but Commission also insists that we have to develop some improvements in our national system of monitoring and control and audits. So that means that at the end, our national system is now, let's say, with additional specifics which came from the EU level, especially when addressing the protection of EU financial interests. This part is also very demanding. Just to highlight one very specific issue, which is, let's say, open in all member states. And this is not only the case of RRF, we already face this issue, but cohesion policy implementation will, or they are now dealing with this issue. So the information about the final beneficiaries and also the contractors at the end, and the informations on the beneficial owners of contractors and beneficiaries at the end. So this was very demanding job for us on the national level. We had to establish the proper monitoring in this regard. So that's why also the first assessment of our first payment plan was, let's say, so long, because we have to present the EU that we are dealing in this area with no exceptions. So as John already highlighted, I have to end, so I'm available for clarifications and answers on your questions. Thanks a lot.
Josip, thank you so much. That's been a really fascinating presentation, particularly that last part where you are drawing on very direct and actual experience of implementation. A lot of that is what's new, if you like, in terms of knowledge that we're very keen to understand how the RRF is working, and particularly your contrast between, if you like, what is the ideal and what is the reality. I think is very helpful. Let's open things up for questions. Feel free to put your hands up or put something in the chat. Let's see, we've got one question from, from Ilias. Ilias, do you want to maybe ask the question? It's quite a long one in the chat. Maybe you could just provide a short question for Josip.
Well, hi. Thanks for the presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes,
we can.
Okay.
Well, I have been preparing this question because also in Greece we face similar hardships, let's say, between managing the two worlds of RRF and cohesion policy funds. But a question is about how Slovenia is planning to address a possibility that milestones linked at the RRP level with reforms and, of course, installments are not reached because they cannot be systematically verified to be aligned with regarding time and synchronicity with the expected results from the implementation of the projects themselves funded by the RRF. So if installments from RRF are delayed due to the delayed tangible reforms, will national budgets cover for the completion of the financing of RRF projects? Since moreover, as I say in my question, cohesion policy funds will not be enough to cover both ERDF, for instance, funds and RRF leftovers, and of course have different scope, regulations, and management systems, at least in some countries. So how do you plan to reconcile this a possibility of a delay in the reforms because of the delay of the implementation of the projects as well?
Thanks very much. Excellent question, Ilias. Josip?
Yes, thanks for a question. So first, we know that we will have a delay of implementation within the RRF for the whole period. So it is not realistic to plan the implementation without delay anymore. So we also try to present this fact to the general public. But nevertheless, as I already said, we are planning the adjustment of RRF. First, when addressing the decreasing of a grant component, we will try to exclude all the measures, and together with measures, milestones and targets, which are affected, let's say, with the major delays. So we will try to put them out of RRF implementation. That's why we are planning to have a speedier implementation or fulfillment of milestones and targets, which will stay in the RRF still, and our installments will be, let's say, much easier to, let's say, implement successfully than with the, let's say, very tricky milestones and targets. This is one part, and in the second part, where I said that we will address the objective circumstances. First, I said that we have some issues related to the inflation, but we also have let's say, issues where we see that objective circumstances influence the time frame of implementation of reforms and investments. And our proposal will be to change the time frame which is already in the existing RRF. So RRP, we will try to adjust the time frame of, let's say, few measures which are within the RRP to be more realistically planned than they are planned in the existing one. It's complicated, but who is part of implementation of RRF probably understand this complexity. What are we planning to do with the, let's say, modification of RRP in Slovenia?
Thank you, Josip. Ilias, did you want to come back on that?
Well, slightly. Thank you very much for the answer. One note and one question is a follow-on, let's say, question from this. Is, of course, as we understand, RRF is coming out of a pressing need to recover as fast as possible from COVID-19 and all the consequences. So linking essentially what RRF is loans that EU managed to gather in a short time from the next 30 years, of course, on some collaterals linked with future cohesion policy money, with reforms, but also project implementation, as you said. So cohesion policy funds, as we know it, and have longer term effect on society and economy. And this takes time to democratically take into account national and regional stakeholder needs. So I think reconciling both of the objectives with scarce resources, as you said, within a perma-crisis environment is a hard task for everyone. And so some say, for instance, that the managing authorities of cohesion policy funds are waiting in line to take on board the leftovers of the financial burden from this relay that will happen in 3 years. So how at the governance level, say, or do you coordinate these two worlds to achieve the complementarity and avoid overloading cohesion policy funds at the end?
When talking about the complementarity, just, okay, we address this issue within the programming of each mechanism. So we have a clear distinction within the both programs when talking about the content. When talking about the, let's say, management or management of implementation of both mechanisms, we are involved in the monitoring committee of cohesion policy implementation. So when discussing, let's say, the selection criteria and all other aspects, we are part of this task, and we are doing our job together. Then I have to say that we have a regularly now let's say, information on the implementation of RRF on the government session each month. So there is also a presence of minister and all other ministers responsible for the cohesion policy. So we are trying to, let's say, somehow synchronize our work. And also when addressing the issue of decreasing the grant component in RRF, especially in those investments, not reforms, investments, which are, let's say, implementable, but not in the programming period, which is very short of till the end of 2026. We will try to, we will see how successful we will be, to transfer those investments which are in line with the cohesion policy objectives to the implementation of a cohesion policy. So this is also one part of our assessment, which will be made in the, let's say, next weeks, especially because in next weeks we will conclude on modification of RRP in Slovenia.
Okay, thanks very much, Josip. Can I open things up to other questions? While we're waiting, Josip, you've talked very clearly about the similarities, differences in terms of the management and implementation. Now, looking at it from a cohesion perspective in terms of regional local developments, to what extent do you see a coherent approach to cohesion in Slovenia across the two instruments, particularly the degree to which decisions on investments in the RRF are taking account of the kind of cohesion challenges that you would set out in the partnership agreement?
To be very frank in this regard, when talking about the implementation of RRF in Slovenia, and let's say, firstly, involvement of regional and local stakeholders, when talking about the programming process, they were involved, but at the end, also from the Commission side, there was a clear message that we are not talking about the cohesion policy, and we are not talking about the models of implementation which could be presented within the cohesion policy, especially those integrated territorial approaches and all others. So first, RRP in Slovenia is a national document. In implementation, there is no specific issue which address the possible involvement of regional and local stakeholders in the implementation. The implementation is a top-down approach. And that is more or less all when talking about the RRF. When talking about the cohesion policy, there is completely different. situation. So we are talking about the one OP divided to two development regions or cohesion regions. Within this, we are also combining two approaches within the cohesion policy. One is the top-down approach, when the line ministries are implementing their responsibilities within the cohesion policy. On the other side, we also established few so-called territorial approaches to address investments, so that let's say local and regional stakeholders are selecting the priorities or projects or investments on their level to address the specific issues which are related to the, or in accordance with the regional development plans in Slovenia. So when talking about the, let's say, involvement of a regional development plans, implementation of them within the RRF, there is no connection. So we are not addressing the regional or local issues more or less. That's it.
Okay, thanks. That's a very clear answer, Josip. Just following on from that, there's obviously the debate starting up at a variety of levels on post-2027. We've got two instruments which have their same legal basis in terms of cohesion, but work very differently. What, based on the experience so far, would be your thinking in terms of a post-2027 architecture? Because we have different possible models. We could continue with just cohesion policy with a different remit. We could continue with a format of the RRF, incorporating a cohesion element. We could see a combination of the two in some form. Do you see a merit in having them more formally integrated in some form, or do you see that having separate instruments with a different implementation structure, one focusing more on the sort of national recovery and resilience objectives and the green and digital transition, the other focusing, if you like, on the regional to local development dimension?
I see this question in two aspects. When talking about the content or objectives of two different words, RRF and cohesion policy. So I think that there is a possibility of, let's say, of a possibility to have a combination between approaches addressing the digital and green, and on the other side, regional development, so-called, in short. I think this is possible. But when talking about the management of the two different aspects, I think that probably there could be some kind of mixture of everything that we know. There could be, let's say, RRF approach in implementation, also in a cohesion policy, but what has to be changed is that to present RRF approach within the shared management approach on the level of EU. So where member state can, let's say, play a more important role in implementation than it is the case in RRF. So in RRF, we are just implementing and trying to follow the instructions of EU level. But if there will be some kind of combination of, or there could be possibility of shared management where member state can perform those activities which are now performed at the level of EU, that could be of, let's say, high added value. So on one side, you can combine different content objectives. On other side, I would say that result-based management presented within the RRF is not bad solution, but with the modality which has to be, I would say, within the shared management mode.
Good, thank you. Thanks very much, Josip. We've passed the hour, but we can maybe just pick up on one, maybe two questions. Serafin?
Thank you. Serafin Pazos from ADL think tank. It's very helpful because, you know, Slovenia is a centralized country with a recent experience in the fund. So, you know, there's no long histories there than in other countries, and there's no federal regions. So it's very easy to analyze the impact of RRF compared to cohesion. But I mean, just following up your previous comment, in terms of eventually combining cohesion policy and the methodologies of RRF, which, as you were right, I mean, the Social Climate Fund probably be the template for the future. What is your view about how realistic it is that cohesion policy, very local, very territorial interventions could use finance not linked to costs and co-financing, because this is the central one of the central terms of cohesion policy, but at the same time one of the main barriers for quick investment. And I think that's perhaps the original value, the added value that many will have in terms of merging the methodology of cohesion policy and RRF. But from the point of view of member states, and you think that it was realistic that very local projects could actually be audited in terms of finance not linked to cost, as in RRF are present? Thank you.
Yeah, it will be hard because let's say that in cohesion policy, as I remember, we are talking about more than, let's say, for one programming period, more than 7,000 projects. So how could you perform result-based management on each project? You can't. So you will have to go, let's say, on a level above the project level, and you will have to, let's say, follow the milestones and targets which will be a defined level above the projects or concrete investments which are very small. So at the end, from the perspective of so far implementation of RRF in Slovenia, everybody, as I said, within the cohesion policy are talking about how good is a result-based approach, and is that the eligibility of expenses is very hard to perform and so on. But at the end, for the beneficiaries, I'm not sure if this is really the case, because there is more flexibility within the, let's say, the implementation of mode of cohesion policy right now than within the RRF, because RRF is so defined and everything is very clear defined in our RRP and implementing decision of a council, and you can't do some flexibilities. But when you are talking about the project, you always can do some improvements during the implementation and so on. And I think that also so that the existing model of implementation of cohesion policy compared to the RRF is not so bad as we would like to present at the end for the beneficiaries.
Great. Thank you very much. I think we could probably continue for quite a long time, but we've gone over the allotted time period. Josip, thank you so much for a very stimulating presentation and for your very clear and interesting answers to the questions, the difficult questions that have been raised. As I said at the start, we will be uploading a copy of the slides, if that's okay with you, Josip, and a recording onto our YouTube channel. So if you'd like to review the discussion once again, the information will be available. Just a reminder that our next EPRC webinar will be on the 26th of April on the topic of leadership and governance challenges in delivering place-based transformation in metropolitan areas, which will be presented by Dr. Irina Phil-Christensen. Please do contact us if you'd like to be register for our mailing list and keep up to date on future events. And we certainly hope to see you again. We hope you've enjoyed this webinar, and you would appreciate future ones also. Let me finish by thanking Josip Mihalic again, thanking you all for your participation and your interest, and take care and goodbye.